Welcome to Untethered to Rooted, a podcast that brings you a collection of stories around grief, healing, and identity. Hear from everyday people how grief and loss shape their identity and how their identity shapes the way they heal and process grief. I'm your host, Dana Daugherty, a licensed psychotherapist with extensive experience dealing with grief, both personally and professionally. And if you want to hear stories with gems and practical tools for healing, stay tuned for more. Hello to all of our listeners. Today, for this episode of Untethered to Rooted, we'll be exploring grief, healing, and neurodivergence. And so I'm excited to discuss this intersection today and introduce Chris Hooten. I'm really excited to have them here because neurodivergence is a lens that is near and dear to my heart as someone who was late diagnosed with ADHD as an adult and also helps clients who also receive a late diagnosis. And so we will be discussing neurodivergence as a framework that is people-centered and opens up the dialogue that is more affirming. And we'll also explore what happens when neurodivergent people grieve and how that may be different than when neurotypical people grieve. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Chris and read their bio. And so Chris Hooten, they, them, is an award-winning facilitator, speaker, writer, and accessibility coach, helping workplaces elevate experiences for neurodivergent and gender-expansive leaders. Recognized as a LinkedIn top facilitation voice and neuromindfulness coach, Chris is a trusted advisor to government agencies, universities, nonprofits, and businesses committed to meeting the needs of diverse stakeholders. The work has been featured in the DEI After 5 podcast, the Equity Gap podcast, the Unyielded podcast, and other outlets, including our podcast here on Tethered to Rooted. And to access their recent writings and free equity frameworks, visit their website at www.chrishootenconsulting.com. And so with that, Chris, I'm really glad to have you here today. And usually I like to introduce our guests with just some important identities about yourself that help socially locate yourself and position yourself so that we know where you're coming from. And so I'd like to ask you, what are some identities that are important to you?
First, thank you for having me, Dana. It's been wonderful talking to you, getting to know you. We've known each other for a while now, and
Yeah.
You've been an amazing part of my time here in the Pacific Northwest. In terms of identities or locations that I'm, sort of at socially at this current juncture of my experience, I am a Black American descendant of enslaved people. For those who benefit from a visual description, I am a dark brown skinned person with a shaved head. I have a green and yellow and other colorful shirt dress that I'm wearing. I have some makeup on, and I have my fingernails painted. There are a couple of degrees behind me and a stack full of books behind me as well. Other identities that are important to me is that I am gender expansive. I used to go by non-binary, but this point in my journey, I find that the word gender expansive is really a lot more helpful because it helps me to sort of think about what I am instead of what I'm not. Right. So the term non-something, as somebody who's working really hard to find deeper roots in their African culture and background, the binary wasn't something that was used or widely recognized in Western Africa. So to define myself as this thing doesn't feel as affirming. And I also find that just being expansive allows me to play with my gender and be joyful and to find love and excitement and also the permission to just be, right? And in a way that non-binary feels sort of static, at least to me right now. I'm also neurodivergent.
Thanks for explaining that.
Yeah, I find that a lot of people are like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm also neurodivergent. I'm also late stage or sort of late discoverer. I centered the word discovery over diagnosis, not because I don't believe in the medical and diagnostic system, but more so just to center the experiences and the voices of the people who are living with these identities. I live with autism. I live with dyscalculia, which is a little bit like dyslexia, only with math and distances and percentages. And I also am living with ADHD. Okay? There are a lot more identities that make up my background, but I am I'm content with that answer right now. It might change tomorrow.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that now. And I'm wondering, of those identities, I'm wondering what people may not know about you, but it's really important for them to know about you for what you will share today.
Yes, yeah. So, as I described earlier, I am a descendant of enslaved people, and I like to tell the story because in my tradition, it's important to describe where you come from and what your roots are when you're describing who you are in this present moment. So I am a descendant of enslaved people, and that also means that I am a descendant of sharecroppers. My grandfather, my maternal grandfather, who has since passed, he was born on the same land in Clinton, Mississippi. That was the location where his ancestors were enslaved. And my grandfather, as a young boy, he was the only child left after his parents moved up north in the first wave of the Great Migration to go up north in a town called Gary, Indiana. He was left behind, and his grandparents were too old to help him with picking the cotton. That's what my grandparents picked, cotton, in Clinton, Mississippi. There was 50 acres to a man named Mr. Robert. My grandfather told me the story when he was on his deathbed in the late stages of cancer, 2017, before he joined the ancestors. And he told me the story, and I think it's really important to share it. He was young, and he decided he wanted to join his parents up north. So he took it upon himself in the hot Mississippi summer weather to by himself go and pick the cotton, 50 acres worth by himself. And it took him all summer, but he eventually did it. And then he took the mass of that and he went to Mr. Robert and said, Mr. Robert, I've done it. I've done the calculations. I picked all the cotton. This should be more than enough to pay for the family to not be sharecroppers anymore, to pay off the debt. That's how sharecropping works. And Mr. Robert looked at him and said, sorry, I guess you must have calculated wrong. This is not enough. Better luck next year. Maybe it was because he was young. Maybe it's because it was the hot Mississippi heat. But with tears in his eyes, he looked at Mr. Robert and said, Mr. Robert, you're a liar. And to this day, I'm still shook by the bravery of my grandfather to tell a white man in apartheid America, which is what the South was in the 50s, to tell him that he was a liar. And Mr. Robert must have also been shocked because just a week later, he came back to my grandfather, who was 14 at the time, and said, Willie, you were right. I did the numbers again, and not only did you pay off the debt, but here's some money for you. And it was a little bit of an insinuation. Hey, here's some money to get out of town, because word had gotten out that my grandfather had done that, and the word was there was a mob working to lynch him. So fortunately, he got out, went up north, and that's how my grandfather, as a young boy, single-handedly lifted my family out of sharecropping in Clinton, Mississippi. And the last thing I'll say about that is, and this is important too, Clinton, Mississippi is the site of a race massacre in 1877. It was the last race massacre that was the sort of the spark that ended Reconstruction in the American apartheid in the Deep South. And I didn't know this, but as part of my healing journey, I did some work and some introspection, and I got the inclination, I got the feeling that this happened, and then did my research, and it confirmed that this happened. So my grandfather, not only was a descendant of enslaved people, but he was also a survivor of racialized trauma and violence. And I'm a descendant of that. And my grandfather fought against apartheid in America. My mother fought against apartheid in South Africa. And I am now the culmination of that. Describes in part why I am as committed to justice and speaking truth to power as I am. It's part of my lineage.
Yeah. How that's so powerful, and thank you for sharing the story of your grandfather, also your mom as well, and how that's part of your lineage, um and justice being such just like a root core. It sounds like driving factor for what you do now as well, and part of your being, really. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, with talking about grief and neurodivergence and healing, I'm wondering just you've shared a little bit about your identities in terms of some neurodivergence that's present, and um, maybe even like grief and healing. Maybe we would love to hear a little more about that, but I love to share what's your connection to this topic today.
Yes. So I'm a bit unique in the sense that by the time I was 16 years old, my father had passed away, joined the ancestors, and my mother passed away not even 3 years after that. And by the time I was a teenager, my mother and my father had passed away, and uh, that was a formative moment in my life. People talk about looking back at their life. Not that I'm old, whatever that means. Um, but looking back at my life, I could tell that both of those passings were important milestones in my journey in terms of the development of my identities, right? Um, and they were also places where I made critical choices uh, that helped me to be the person I am currently. My siblings made different choices, and there are different places in their life. And that's not to condone or to condemn anyone's actions. It's just to highlight how grief and death and loss has this effect where oftentimes we grieve as we are, right? So people
Can you
say
say
that this.
more? Yeah, what does that mean to you?
I think there's often a phrase of things are seen as they are. You don't see things as they are. You see them as you are, right? And I think that we don't grieve things as they are. We grieve them as we are. So our lens and our perspective and our orientation and our viewpoint and perspective, they all shape how and if we're allowed to grieve, right? That's what
Yeah.
that for me. That's what it means when I talk about how my identities are intricately wrapped up into grief and whether I was allowed to grieve and how, right?
Yeah.
Uh, and I think that grief is a beautiful, intricate part of life. And unfortunately, not everyone is able to have the space to grieve as we need to.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, so with that, I'm wondering, like, how did it shape how you grieved? How did all of that shape how you dealt with loss, how you talked about loss? How did your lineage influence how you talked about grief? Yeah.
So I'll just give one example. This may seem like it's contradictory to people who just heard me tell the story about my grandfather, who I loved very dearly, right? And when my mother passed away, when during the funeral, uh, I was crying. I was beside myself. I was, crying deep, deep, deep tears, right? Because I love my mother deeply. And for those who've ever lost a mother, it's difficult to describe. But to me, though, I'll speak for myself. It felt as though somebody had taken a rusty gauntlet, stabbed my chest, clenched my heart, and then ripped it out. Uh, when you lose your mother, you lose a part of yourself. Right?
Yeah.
Of course, losing a father is terrible too. Losing anybody is terrible. I think for me though, losing a mother, I was so so angry. I was so heartbroken, so lost, so confused because it was surprising. My mother had hidden her disease. She had been battling heart disease for a number of years, and she didn't let any of her children know because she was worried about that impacting our choices and um, so she passed away. It was a shock to everybody, um, and she was only 51 years old, very young, very young. And my father was 47, my mother was 51. My maternal aunt, my mother's sister, didn't. She passed away shortly after that, at around 53. So, uh, my family does not have a long history in terms of like, longevity. And so I say that I rather morbidly joke that death and I are good friends at this point, right? She has visited many times, and I've had to look at death more than I think somebody my age. I'm 32 years old, right? And I've experienced a lot of grief. You know, my mother, my grandfather, my aunts, my father, other people in my family. Uh, During that funeral of my mother, I was crying. My grandfather said, "Don't cry. Why are you crying?" Right. And so somebody, I am gender expansive. I was socialized as male. And so this is where identities sort of intersect, right? Like somebody
Yeah.
who's socialized as male and is black, you're sort of held on to or sort of encouraged to navigate the expectations of masculinity. Masculinity is very restrictive in terms of emotional expression. Scholars have written about this for a while. Great scholars to look into are bell hooks, right? She's sort of my inspiration in terms of understanding how to heal from masculinity and its harms, right? But my grandfather was doing the best that he could, right? And that was also a trauma. And so I'd like to offer up this quote by somebody who's also a person I look to in terms of guidance and I revere for his scholarship, Dr. Gabor Mate, who's a trauma researcher based in Vancouver, British Columbia, has written extensively about addiction and trauma and healing and sickness. And in his most recent book, The Myth of Normal, he describes trauma as not just the bad things that should not have happened, but also the good things that should have happened but did not. And I'll repeat that because I think that that's particularly powerful for people
Please
to
do.
feel. Uh, Trauma is not just the bad things that happened, but also the good things that should have happened but did not. Right. And so, taking this more expanded understanding of what trauma is and how it plays into our life, and grief is very much a trauma, right? Because usually people, even if you do expect to lose a person, it's a horrifying experience. Uh, to grieve my mother in this public setting was one trauma. To then have somebody who I love deeply and dearly say that I should not be crying uh, was also deeply traumatic, right? Because as somebody who's socialized as male, I was held to the standard: do not cry in public, even though your mother is quite literally steps away from you in a box, right? And so, in that way, those things shaped my ability to grieve. And I have been healing and reparenting myself ever since.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure. And just, I think that's so important what you said just about how masculinity and notions of how you were socialized, how expectations around that. People were working with what they had and what they knew, right? And then also, was this the same grandfather also that
Yep.
then went up north, right? So just you're really painting this picture of how uh,
Yeah.
all of this history was like kind of projected onto you and shaping how you were or were not allowed to grieve. Um, yeah,
And I think that the
yeah,
special part about that is the role that intergenerational trauma plays.
yeah, absolutely.
Uh, I have been because just to give some context about my family, uh, we experience my siblings and I experience housing insecurity and food insecurity because my mother was impacted by the drug epidemic of the 80s. We now know that there are other things that happened in terms of like the role that the government played in both deindustrializing the centers of the cities and allowing people to be impoverished. We now know what happened with that. But she was impacted by that. right? And the trauma of not having your family support you. She was not able to find work, stable work after that. So my siblings and I, we got used to waking up in the middle of the night or the morning and seeing all of our belongings in black trash bags in the middle of the floor, and not needing to know what happened or saying a word, because we knew that meant grab a bag and go to the bus stop. Right? Like hunger, in the words of Biggie, Christmas missed us a lot growing up, right? And so I share that to say that intergenerational trauma and grief plays a huge role, a determinative role in shaping our lives. So when people say, you're just talking about grief, it's not just talking about grief. Grief is an intricate part of life.
Yeah.
To live openly and to live fully is to be able to grieve well, right? Is to be able to love well. And I think grief is just love with nowhere to go. Right? So like I was grieving because I loved my mother. I was grieving because I loved my grandfather and my father and my aunt, right? And so when we don't allow people the space and the spirit to really grieve fully, we're robbing them of the ability to live fully.
And I think that makes so much sense in terms of what you were saying earlier about like we grieve as we are, right? And I imagine that all of that containment around grief, I'm wondering like how that connected with then grieving differently from your siblings and coming into what you like now what you know as about yourself around gender expansion and neurodivergence.
Yes, yes, yes. So it's clear to me now that grief was not something that happened because I had learned how to be fully myself. Grief was the catalyst, and it continues to be the catalyst for me discovering who I am. And what I mean by that is, in the middle of the pandemic, we were all sort of locked down, and a lot of us were forced to work from home. In that uh, situation, I discovered both my neurodivergence and my gender expansion.
Wow. Yes.
Because it was clear to me, without having to navigate gendered spaces every single day, that gender, its conceptualization, its expectations, the heaviness of it, the limitations that it provided, it no longer fit me. I was not, and I was able to look back at my life and realize there weren't times when I really legitimately felt I was able to be myself in these spaces that were gendered.
Yeah.
I always drifted liking this or doing things that quote unquote weren't considered, appropriate for the gender I was assigned at birth, right? And so I decided to, identify differently. And I moved across the country, and that was part of it. And also neurodivergence. That was a more complex journey, but the pandemic was such a jolt, such a break in tradition and the continuation that we had been, sort of mulling through. That I crashed and I melt. We call it melting down in the autistic community, right? A shutdown, a meltdown. The ways that I had been taught and I had learned to be were no longer fitting and did not actually allow me to thrive. So I was in a associate director job at a university, finishing my graduate program, writing my capstone. There's a pandemic, right? We're now working virtually from home. So much, right? And so it wasn't working anymore, and that allowed me, in that state of being broken, allowed me to grieve and to just be. And out of that place, it was clear to me that I needed to pursue support. And in that process, I discovered, um, rather organically, that I have autism. Right? I live with autism. I live with ADHD, and I live with dyscalculia, in addition to being gender expansive, right? And all of that is a process of grieving, because I had to grieve who I thought I was supposed to be.
Yes.
Right? Like before I could fully open up and and sort of embrace and become who I actually am. I had to grieve who I thought I had to be, and I had to grieve the younger version of me who knew who I always was, but knew that they weren't safe pursuing that.
Yes. Yeah.
Right?
So environment played a really big role as well.
Environment, social pressures, religion, culture, economic realities, right? Like I had to harden myself and just be like, okay, I can't actually be that. So I got to be this. And
So
that,
you were either
that's a
or.
harm.
Yeah. Yeah. You're presented with like an either or decision. Yeah. Yeah. I mentioned those things earlier as like kind of, it's like what it sounds like is like there's this parallel discovery that happened in the environment of containment, enough that, as you said in your words, like there was this catalyst that it was the overwhelm became so much that then it was like, whoa, like I got to think about this differently than I have been. Right? Does that sound right?
I've got to, even more so than I got to think about this, I've got to feel about this differently.
Well, thank you. Yes. Yeah.
And I think, and this is where my friend Sophia comes in. Sophia is the 3D brain model that, for those who benefit from a site description, it's a colorful 3D brain model about 2 times the size of an actual human brain. And I talk about part of my being a neuromindfulness coach and being certified by the Neuromindfulness Institute, and my equity work and how I talk about neurodiversity is understanding to be with the brain and not work against it. Right. So part of my understanding my neurodivergence and how that relates to grief was understanding that it's incredibly vital to go towards or to walk towards or to sort of move towards an affirming understanding of neurodiversity. And that means certain things. It means accepting differences, right? Not as something that's a challenge to improve things or to close gaps or to try to catch up, right? But to accept differences, not as good or bad, just as they are. Right? We're not assigning value, normative value, to your ability to be quote unquote low or high functioning. I don't use that language, right? Because very few times do we say somebody's a lower high functioning any other identity except for neurodivergence. Right? It's an insult to even use that language. But you were going to say something, Dana?
I was going to ask you about just for our listeners who are like, okay, Dana and Chris are talking about neurodivergence. I don't even know what that is. I was just like, maybe we should take a step back a little bit and just, what is neurodivergence? What is neurodiversity? Yeah, can you highlight that a little bit? And thank you for Sophia too. Maybe Sophia can make an appearance in this explanation. But
neurodiversity and being neurodivergent is our body's ability or way of evolving in response to our environment. We have more information than we've ever had. We have more stimulus than we've ever had as human beings. We have 60,000 thoughts in a day. Some say 65,000, some say even more, right? So we're seeing higher levels of complexity where there are bigger problems that need solving. And people say, well, what are you talking about? How is that evolutionarily beneficial? Well, if you have a village of 100 people, and all 100 people in that village think the exact same way, that means they perceive information the exact same way, they feel the exact same way, they look at problems the exact same way, they try to solve problems the exact same way. If there is a problem that comes along, let's say a disease or a drought or whatever calamity, and people don't see it as a problem and they don't think of it differently, that means there's only one way in that village to try to solve that problem. That's a pretty low likelihood that they're going to solve that problem.
Yeah.
Right? So when we have more neurodiversity, it diversifies and expands our repertoire of ways of processing information, sensing information, perceiving our environment, coming up with solutions. This goes back to the brain, right?
Yeah.
So neurological differences are a way for us as a species to increase our ability to problem solve, which is right on time because there are a lot of crises that we're facing.
Yeah.
Right? And so when I talk about neurodiversity, some people will say, so the umbrella term, it just means that people who are ADHD, people who are who live with autism, people who are bipolar disorder, it's an umbrella term, people who are anxious. That may be true, but the problem I find is that it doesn't give you language that is affirming. So when we talk about neurodivergent affirming language, from my perspective, it is really valuing the importance of not just abstractly talking about this an umbrella term, because that's lovely. What do we do with that information?
Yeah.
How should we feel with that information? We don't know what all these acronyms mean because it's medicalized. But if you see this person is different as a child, they look at things differently, they respond to stimuli differently in their environment, they feel things differently, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But in the last 40 years, we've tried to divide people as neurotypical, which means the people who respond in the way that we think in our society is appropriate. And the people who are neurotypical are the people who have variances of responses to their stimuli in their environment.
Mm-hmm.
And then we prescribe normative evaluations. This is bad. Is it bad that kid cannot, quote unquote, sit down in a classroom for 8 hours and write quietly? Only in a world where we think that it's important and valuable for kids to sit down for 8 hours in a desk and write quietly.
Good point.
In a world where we value people being able to come up with problems and to respond quickly and to be on their toes and to be agile, we would favor the child with ADHD, but we don't. So when I talk about we grieve as we are, we do a lot of things as we are. So these labels are more so a reflection of our society's valuations of what we think are important and what we think are valuable than they say anything about the person who is, quote unquote, labeled as neurodivergent.
Yeah, I think that's so important that you made that distinction, Chris, and just I think a lot of people probably for the first time are just maybe even grasping a little bit of like, okay, so what are these? So have I just been living with society's values then? Like, am I neurotypical? Am I neurodivergent? Like, what does that mean? I've only started hearing this more. And so I'm wondering, just as far as like neurodivergence as well, and we've been using both of these terms a little bit, neurodiversity and neurodivergence.
Yeah.
Can you just tell like a little bit of the difference between those as well?
Well, it's important to talk a little bit about the history. So I'm not going to act like I got this at the top of my dome. I am looking at something because I prepared for this.
Yeah, sure.
Cassian Asasumasu coined the term neurodivergent and neurodivergence around 2000. Asasumasu is an American autistic rights activist, and she is multiply neurodivergent. She's also biracial, and for what it's worth. And the term neurodiversity was started by somebody who shall remain nameless because she is a Australian trans exclusionary radical feminist and has said some incredibly transphobic things. I won't take away that she termed the term neurodiversity, but I don't have to give her credence and to lift up her voice by saying her name.
Understood.
So these are two terms. I think it's important to sort of name that these are two women, female-centered people who are neurodivergent, and they have developed these frameworks and these words and terms in response to what they perceived as over medicalization and overly sanitized and deficit minded framing of things like ADHD, autism, being bipolar, having anxiety, all of these other things, right? Because these terms, these individualistic sort of perspectives, were ways in which in the 1960s or 70s or a little bit earlier, mostly white men, because those two were doctors at the time, in white suits and coats, how they would describe this experience to the parents of, caregivers of, educators, and later employers of neurodivergent people. And so it was always described as attention deficit hyperactive disorder. Like in the term, it's deficit.
Yeah, you're right.
So I'm already, starting from literally a deficit, because we've positioned other people who do not have ADHD as not having a deficit, but you have this deficit. And the underlying language, or sort of the implied understanding of logic, is if you are to be considered deserving, if you are to be considered appropriate, logical, and in our Western society, logical is equated with moral, right? You have to work to try to be more like neurotypical people, right? Your goal is to try to have less of a deficit in attention. Your goal is to not be as autistic openly. This is where things like masking come in. So masking is when a person who is autistic or is neurodivergent, so, those are not, of course, the same thing, but neurodivergent people can mask. It just has historically and socially been more understood as an autistic trait and response. Masking is a trauma response. It's a response to an environment that is not openly welcoming and affirming to the ways that autistic people like myself show up in the world. I'll give you one example. As a kid, my mother would always say, "Fix your face." Because as an autistic child, and there have been studies on this, autistic people have a more difficulty, I don't even like that framing, but have more difficulty being deceitful. We cherish and value alignment in how we experience things and how we express ourselves. So if you as a kid, I remember tasting my aunt's coconut cake, and it was bad. I remember hating it. I still hate coconut. The coconut flakes and it's terrible. But as a child, I ate it and I was like, ugh, and I spit it out. I got in trouble because the assumption is you're supposed to say it's okay. You're supposed to and swallow it even if it's not good. But as an autistic, I didn't do that. But I learned over time that what adults want is for you to be seen and not to be heard. So I learned to mask.
Yeah, and I'm like, as you're saying that, I feel like I'm connecting it back to this earlier point of your grandfather at your mom's funeral, and how, like, another way of looking at that was like your grandfather was teaching you how to mask your feelings.
My grandmother taught my mother how to mask, and my mother taught me how to mask. It even goes even further. His mother, again, if you go back to my story, she had left him in the Deep South. He had other siblings. She went with the other siblings up north and left him. He was the only one that didn't get brought with his siblings.
Wow.
Can you imagine the trauma of that? His lack of feeling safe. Like, why am I not worthy? Why didn't she pick me? I now fully feel, I don't have any proof because he passed on to the ancestors, but I fully look back at his life and I'm like, you probably live with autism. He was very black and white in his thinking, very committed, loved routine, very little changed with my grandfather in all the time that I knew him. Right? And I think that he lived with autism. So if that was the case and his mother rejected him, that's an unbroken chain.
Yeah.
Of neurodivergence impacting my life. And trauma is like, it's like interest. It compounds with every generation. Yeah. If it is not paid, if the trauma is not addressed, if you're not allowed to grieve and given the space to grieve, it will compound. And so when I broke down in my late 20s, before I discovered my neurodivergence, that was my trauma, my intergenerational trauma in my body, in my mind, coming to fruition and saying, you've got to make a decision. Either you're going to heal and grieve, or you're not. And you're going to continue to suffer.
Yeah. Thank you for just highlighting. I think we're really touching at this intersection of like neurodivergence, intergenerational trauma, also like intergenerational, like non-understanding of neurodivergence as well, and then grief here. And I think this is really important what you're saying. And so when you were hit with this crossroads of, all right, it's the pandemic, and I'm now here with all of these feelings. This is really feeling overwhelming. I'm wondering how coming into just understanding neurodivergence for yourself, how did those identities that you were coming into influence how you were healing differently? Like when you took the path and you were like, all right, I'm going to do something different. Like, what was different about it? Maybe what's also different. Maybe you can drop in a little bit. Like, what did you notice in terms of just being different in how you were exploring healing with the understanding of neurodivergence through that lens?
Yeah. So just to give some details and to sort of back up a little bit, when we're talking about the differences in ways that neurodivergent people grieve, that isn't just my personal experience. This is a documented research phenomenon that we're seeing more and more now because neurodivergent people are becoming the authors of our own stories. We are becoming the doctors and the researchers and asking the questions. And it's amazing what happens when the people who are studying and defining us are actually us, as opposed to people who are not us, right? That's an important distinction. But some ways, and this is again something that I'm reading from my own research that I prepared, neurodivergent people may experience grief differently than neurotypical people. And our grief can be complicated by a number of factors. I would say it's shaped by, but that's language that I think is more humanizing than complicated by. Emotional responses. We may show delayed or extreme emotions, or we may not show any emotions at all, right? They may be scrambling emotions. They may be laughing at inappropriate times, right? Communication. We may have trouble or difficulty expressing ourselves or express ourselves differently in ways that other people may not understand at the time or that may not align with social cues, right? And we also have trouble sometimes asking for help because we are afraid sometimes that we're going to be ridiculed or punished for not conforming to social expectations when it comes to communication or grieving. There are other things that are important, such as sensory issues or sensitivity issues, right? Routine and predictability challenges. Like, what's more stark in terms of having a problem or trouble interrupting your routine than losing a loved one when you didn't expect to lose a loved one, right? Like, that's a horrifying experience because it means that you've lost this person, but also means that you as yourself has changed. Everything about you changed. Everything around you changes, and it's an unfolding change. So it's difficult to really see how it's going to impact your life going forward. And for people who are neurodivergent, we sometimes especially benefit from clarity and certainty and predictability. And then support needs and coping are often we see people who are neurodivergent in the midst of grief. We are challenged with our ways of coping, and our supports are no longer working. Right? If that person who you're grieving was your primary caretaker, or helped you with a lot of your supports, and they're no longer here, you've got to find a way to get that need met in some other way.
Yeah.
Right? And the
Do you have an
last thing
example of that, or I'm just curious for yourself?
There's a lot of examples. I mean, it's just for me, losing my grandfather was especially hard, and I didn't cry or grieve him initially. I did it years later. Right, this is just another example of delayed grief because I don't know why. I was in DC at the time. I was working a job. It was a stressful job. I didn't have the capacity, to really truly give this the grief that deserved. I didn't go to his funeral. I have a relationship with my grandmother, who's his widow. Right? We are really close, and she understands. And I visited his grave now. But for me, I realized as somebody who was autistic, funerals are just a lot. They're overstimulating. So for somebody,
censoring earlier, censoring, right? So
I mean, come on, right? You've got people grieving, you got people screaming, hollering. Somebody may be doing the Holy Spirit. Um, you're encouraged to be in a suit that may or may not be comfortable. There's a procession. You got to stay around for the repast, and you got to have dinner and go to a church maybe you may not be comfortable with or really know. All these people who you may or may not know telling you stories about somebody who you're like, who are you again? Right. So it's. Do you watch Game of Thrones or House of Dragons?
I have, yes, Game of Thrones.
So if you're familiar with the House of the Dragons, Black folk, I'm just gonna say this: we call it House of Dragons, and we don't call House of the Dragon, but that's just my folk, House of Dragons. The character of Helena is she's not officially canonically neurodivergent, and it's suspected by a lot of people that she is autistic. Right, the character is autistic, or at least autistic coded. And in the scene where her child is, she's behind him, and there's a procession for his funeral after he is unceremoniously cut down by another character. She is overstimulated. She is frustrated. She talks about going, I not wanting to do this, not wanting to go through the ritual of this, but she's pressured to it by her mother, right? And we see her have a meltdown when the procession is stuck in the city and people are clamoring for her and yelling and giving their, we're with you, we're sorry what this happened. It's loud. It may be smelly. It may be frustrating. She doesn't want to do it, right? But she's forced into it by her parents and people who are more power than her, right? So that's just one example of how it's difficult for a lot of times for people who are autistic or who are, otherwise and other neurodivergent characteristics to grieve as we quote unquote are expected to in social constraints. And the last
sense, as you're sharing, yeah.
Oh no, and the last thing is like we may experience religious and spiritual questions when dealing with grief.
Okay. Yeah.
And this is important to me in terms of like this, our relationship with grief and what happened. How do I put this? I grew up Christian. I was raised Christian, Baptist. And as somebody who's neurodivergent, gender-expansive, and Black American with African roots, getting closer to my African roots has been the true way for me to grieve more effectively.
For people who don't understand like Baptists, and then can you
yes,
what would be the different? Yeah.
A Baptist is somebody it's part of a Christian denomination where you believe that somebody who's dipped below water, it's a ceremonial being washed of our sins that emulates or replicates the act of Jesus Christ passing on, washing us clean of our sins. So it's almost like we believe that this man 2,000 or so years ago was crucified, and that ceremoniously washed us of our sins. And as followers of this man, in the book that he left us with, we're going to do this activity and then be born again.
Right? For Baptists, yeah.
For Baptists. And Christians more generally believe in this man and what people say that he believed in. The way that I sort of talk about this is I have always been critical of Christianity, even as a child. And as a person who is Black American, I was not encouraged to pursue spirituality in a way that felt affirming to me, in a way that honored the collectivist ways in which African peoples have historically practiced faith. Right? So there are a lot of things that we don't have time to get into, but as somebody who was rejecting European standards of understanding time, of European standards of faith, of religion, of dominance of the mind over the body, as I released my expectations around and my alignment with these frameworks and these understandings and these beliefs, and started to embrace a more deeply rooted cultural tradition that is rooted in my Africanness, right? I was able to more freely and firmly become who I am. So even though a lot of people will say, like, neurodiversity is quote unquote a white thing, I very much reject that. Again, the person who termed the term neurodivergent is a biracial woman, right? Asian and from European descent. And what we term as neurodiversity and neurodivergent in European culture, people who are African, indigenous, oceanic have been practicing these things for thousands of years, but they didn't label it as a problem. So somebody might have been, what we call spirits, or, this person was really sensitive, or they noticed things other people notice, or they had high energy, or they hyper focused. That person might have been considered a shaman or a healer, or somebody who has special particular abilities in a culture pre-European contact, right? They had specific roles that were often revered and appreciated, but it was in that specific social context. It's a part of my healing journey has been not just healing in isolation my neurodiversity and my gender, healing from European standards, and these are intricately intertwined. So as I heal from racialized trauma and internalized anti-Blackness, and find myself more deeply rooted in my Africanness and love of and appreciation of all of that I am, as a part of that, I can see my neurodiversity in a new light, in a more affirming way. I can see my gender in a more affirming way when understood from a non-European lens.
Yeah. And so no, that's helpful. That's really helpful for just people who are like, I don't understand. What do you mean by rooting in your Africanness and your and what do you mean you were like moving away from your Baptist roots? And I'm wondering, like, stepping into more of like your African roots with like the spiritual side, or even other ways as well. I'm wondering how that's influenced your maybe like rituals or traditions or ways in which you process grief and hold it, or ways of honoring it.
People might think like, this is weird that this person is smiling a lot during this conversation. One, I don't think it's weird to smile about grief, because for me it's not like, the more I learn and the more I remember, because it's not just about learning, it's remembering. The more I am in healing with my body, the more I learn about the fact that the linear perspective of time that Europeans have sort of offered the world. There's a past that can never be touched or known fully. There's a present that's only in the here and now, and then there's a future that is unknowable, right? If you sort of map their perspective of the importance of progress, to be progressive is to be considered scientific, is to be considered rational, is to be considered, right, better than. Orient the future as something that is an ideal project to continuously work towards. And in so doing, your present can only be judged by how well your future is. If I do well in the future, that will be an indictment, or it will be a validation of how I spend the present. Right? Time is not something that is just is. It is something that should be used in the same way that they view the land as something that should be used, as minerals, as plants, as animals, as other people, as resources to be used in a grand design. And for me, my understanding of the traditional, again, pre-European contact, West African understanding of time is as a dynamic, cyclical relationship. And in that understanding, there is no clean delineation between the past, present, and the future. And that means that the ancestors are not gone. The ancestors are with us, and we are with the descendants.
What a different framework of then looking at death and loss, then, right?
And exactly. And so, like, when somebody says, oh, I'm sorry for me, I have a altar that we talked about earlier, right? This is every week I take time to honor and revere my ancestors, right? And I won't go into detail about all the different things that I do, but because it's sacred to who I am and my practice, right? It's changes depending on your relationship with the person and the people you're revering, but it allows me to be deeply rooted in something bigger than myself, right? And so when I'm grieving now, I'm happy because I have the prospect of one day joining my ancestors. I'm deeply rooted in a tradition, right? And that is a spiritual relationship. It is not purely a metaphysical or a scientific or a rational one, right?
Yes.
And I think that's what's missing a lot from these things. So when we talk about my meditation and my yoga and other things that I do, other things that other people do, uh, it is infused with my spirituality,
I see.
right?
Yeah.
That it is powered by my spirituality. So that is, I cannot separate healing truly from my relationship with the all. People may view this differently. Maybe it's a God in Christianity or Allah in Islam or Yahweh. You know, whoever you ascribe to, right? For me, though, it is a different relationship with the all of the universe, and so I think that has been particularly healing and freeing and affirming for me.
In all aspects of what you were, it sounds like it was healing in all aspects of what you were discovering about yourself. Yeah. Right.
Yes.
Yeah. And so I'm wondering, I feel like you've already answered this question, but this big question I have around just like how have grief and healing influenced or shaped your identities? It sounds like it's shaped your acceptance of yourself, but also your own spirituality and how your worldview, how you see yourself in the world. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And this all came about after a particularly traumatic experience that I had in a former workplace, where I experienced harassment and discrimination. I was the only Black person on that staff. I was the only gender-expansive or trans person in that staff. I was the youngest person on that staff, and I had been brought in as their diversity, equity, and inclusion person.
Wow.
And right, and there were a number of horrifying experiences. Having my gender identity commented on, and it was horrifying, terrible. And once I was released from that place, I made the decision to invest in my own business and invest in myself. And it's a different understanding because I chose in that moment to invest in a slow business. So my business is equal parts healing, investment in myself, research in affirming, neurodivergent affirming, gender affirming, culturally affirming, pedagogy, learning how to be an effective facilitator, learning how to be an effective presenter of research, right? And also helping businesses and organizations and nonprofits navigate these changes because the world is becoming and the country is becoming more neurodivergent, more gender expansive, and more racially diverse. This is unmistakable. It's unquestionable, right? And it's happening at a pace where people aren't prepared for it, least of all workplaces and governments. And I help them navigate these things. And so when you're talking about healing, I have worked hard to build a life where my work is not an impediment to my healing. My work amplifies my healing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's truly shaped you. And I'm wondering, just as we're wrapping up, I usually like to ask, what do you wish, if there's like one thing you wish people knew about this topic, or even just like one thing you wish you knew that you know now about neurodivergence and the intersection of neurodivergence and intergenerational trauma and gender expansion and grief and healing? Like, there's so much we covered today. Spirituality. And like, what do you wish you knew that you know now?
I think that I feel that I wish that people understood that there is an alternative. I feel people's stress. I feel their anxiety. I feel their unsettledness. Right? As somebody who, and this may sound, sort of egotistical, and for that I apologize if that is how it's received. I have been vested and I have reached a state of healing that few in America or the West feel. And so whenever I leave my home or whenever I interact with people, I can quite literally feel their deep state of unsettling, their fear. And in contrast to the words of the late Margaret Thatcher, who said there is no alternative, I would disagree. There was a world before white supremacy, before colonization, before ableism, before all of these things. And there will be a world afterward. And that world lives in all of us. Right? And so as this world, people say all the time, things feel as though they're falling apart. I see it differently. I see that things are falling into place.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. We carry that with us as we think about everything you've shared. Chris, thank you for sharing so much of yourself today. I'm so grateful for you sharing the stories of your grief and healing and your own discovery. I've learned a lot from you today, and I believe that our listeners will learn a lot as well. And thank you. I'm grateful for you sharing so much of yourself. And so as we wrap up, if our listeners want to connect with you, and please let us know if that is okay with you.
It is.
Good. If they want to connect with you, I'm wondering the best way for them to connect with you.
I am the most active on LinkedIn. I have 11,000 and growing followers. I'm a top LinkedIn voice. And so I always post my comments on LinkedIn. And I'm also on Instagram. I'm building that back up. And if you want to reach out to talk about sponsorships or to invite me to share my story or to facilitate a training, I encourage you to reach out at my website, chrishootenconsulting.com. I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, all right. You heard it from them. It is Chris Hooten Consulting, and I'll spell it out. Chris Hooten, Hooten, consulting.com. And I'll share that at the end of our show notes or in our show notes. So you all will see all that information there. Chris, thank you much. Thank you so much again for sharing.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. Good one.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Untethered to Rooted. Untethered to Rooted is produced and hosted by me, Dana Daugherty. Original music was composed and performed by the ever-talented Daniel Dickinson. Thanks so much to our guests for sharing with us today. And if you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. And follow us on social at Untethered to Rooted. And if you didn't like it, what podcast? Dana who? Until next time, take and give good care.